우라 영접들아 즉
Kim Il-sung was a dictator of North Korea from its foundation in 1948 to his death in 1994. Like many of his contemporaries, he left a long-lasting legacy, although none was as direct and internationally relevant as his own. Kim was born on the 15th of April 1912. Meanwhile, his Titanic was sinking. He shared the same birthday with such great people as Leonardo da Vinci, Emma Watson, and me. Strangely enough, his family was Presbyterian, apparently, and more importantly, his family were not particularly keen on the Japanese, and tended to engage in anti-Japanese activities such as protesting, debating, probably, and also leaving Korea to go to Manchuria in 1920, which was a really good idea, up until the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931. But before we get ahead of ourselves, in 1926 Kim founded what he called the Down with Imperialism Union, which is commonly celebrated as the foundation of the Workers' Party of Korea. While you might say it's a bit of a tenuous connection, the guy was 14 when he made this. Before you go feeling terrible about having done nothing with your life, please do bear in mind that this organisation didn't really do anything of note. Anyway, by 1930 he was a little bit of a filthy communist and got himself arrested for subversive activities, which in 1930s China really just meant sharing your pizza. When he got out, he started hanging around with anti-Japanese guerrilla groups around Manchuria, which is quite pessimistic considering that the Japanese hadn't even invaded yet. And then one day, someone decided to blow up a Manchurian-Japanese railway line. The Japanese blamed it on the Chinese, which kind of made sense when you think about it in fairness to them. I mean, the only people that really knew what happened there were the few people that were actually there trying to blow the thing up, and where was it? Again? Yeah, China. It would have been a bit unreasonable to have blamed the Dutch for this, but not that unreasonable. In any case, one thing led to another, and the Japanese found themselves invading Manchuria, and those guerrilla groups from earlier suddenly made a lot of sense. Kim Il-sung then started fighting, and was actually pretty good at what he did, rising quickly in the ranks as a leader. Some guy called Wei Cheng-min turned him from a little bit of a dirty communist into a big bit of a dirty communist. At one point, the Japanese caught someone who they thought was Kim's wife and threatened to kill her if they didn't surrender, but didn't, so they killed her. No one's quite sure if it actually was his wife, so that happened. At some point, the Japanese chased Kim Il-sung and his soldiers across the Soviet border into the evil empire, a lawless land of hatred and misery. Seeing soldiers cross their border into the Siberian wasteland, the Soviets brought them into the Red Army and kept them in a camp for some time, where Kim Jong-il was born, depending on the ask, and he'll become important later. He also had another son there, but he wasn't important because he drowned in a lake. Kim Il-sung did actually fight for the Red Army, but who cares? There's somewhat of a problem presented to historians researching his early career, because he was actually quite competent, and the records at the time were sketchy at best. It is very difficult to tell the difference between genuine praise of the man and propaganda, and as a result, depending on how you interpret his career, he was either an earth-walking god, or a man who was good at leading on the power of others. When World War II was ending, the Soviet Union decided to declare war on Japan just to see what would happen, and what happened was that they were able to occupy about half of Korea. When the war ended, Stalin requested recommendations for communist leaders to rule the zone, and Kim's name came up. And so he was installed the dictator of North Korea. Well, actually, there's this guy called General Shchikov, a Russian guy who kind of led the occupation for a long time. He pretty much ran the show for the first few years. His power greatly reduced when they actually did set up the DPRK in 1948, but he still held quite a lot of power, and he kept it up until the Chinese turned up. Well, no, the Chinese hadn't actually turned up yet, but the North decided to see if it could replicate the success of the Chinese Civil War by invading the South, and it went very well up until the Americans turned up. Anyway, we'll get to that later. By the time Kim was given this position, he had spent pretty much his entire life in China, and didn't really know much Korean. For this reason, he had to take lessons in the language before he could do any kind of public speaking. Evidently the power got to his head, as by 1949 he was already referring to himself as the Great Leader, and started consolidating his power to an extent that none of his other contemporaries really did. This is probably why his legacy is still fucking going. They invaded the South, and it was going really well for them, up until the Americans came up and intervened. The war then started going really badly for them, so they called up Mao to see if they could have some military aid, and they said yes. It was actually going really well for the Americans until the Chinese turned up with their veteran army from the Chinese Civil War and it turned into a stalemate. The only real effects of the war was a demilitarized zone, incentive for a South Korean military build-up, and a wonky border. North Korea had barely kept itself alive through foreign intervention. This clear victory was marked by the construction of Kim Il-sung Square in Pyongyang, which is used almost exclusively for military parades, as indeed is the military itself. This time marked the beginning of further consolidation of power, yes, even more. And it was around this time that Kim started being a little evil. He came up with this thing called the Songbun system, which was somewhat complex, but it's kind of like the Chinese social credit system, where the state gauges how much of a threat you are and started using it to imprison and persecute perceived dissidents. Concentration camps called
관리소,
sprung up around the country. I could go on about the conditions of these camps, but they're worse than ass fish. They still exist. Look them up if you want to. Anyway, in 1955, he made a speech describing a new philosophy called Juche, described by anyone who cared as an original, brilliant, and revolutionary contribution to international and national thought. Although it probably wasn't that original, arguably wasn't that brilliant, and no one outside North Korea really cares. The word roughly translates to self-reliance, and states that a nation can somehow achieve true socialism by becoming self-reliant. If there are any economists watching as regards to the idea of self-reliance, you can laugh and like and subscribe now. If there are any communists watching as regards to the idea of a communist world split into independent, isolated nations, you can also laugh and like and subscribe. It could be described as a form of isolationist communism or as an excuse to neglect rural villages and allowing them to solve their own problems, which sounds like a very nice and efficient idea until you realise that their entire economy was centralised. The ideology was a sort of opposite to another Korean concept called
사대,
which roughly translates to serving the great or the powerful, referring historically usually to the Chinese, more recently the Japanese, or right now the Russians. Pretty much anyone in the neighbourhood that was bigger than them. Where China had communism with Chinese characteristics, North Korea had Juche, which was sort of communism with Korean characteristics. The idea being that the basic Marxist vision for the future and how we'll end up with communism states that we started from feudalism and then that would develop instead into capitalism, which would lead to a socialist revolution, which would ultimately lead to communism. But Korea had jumped straight from feudalism to socialism, and thus this basic model was inadequate. There's also a little bit in there about how a great leader would be essential for the running of the country, and by this time he had entrenched himself so deep into the political system that he actually managed to get away with that. This whole personality cult idea, by the way, was based off the tendencies of the two most deadly dictators of all time, being Mao and particularly the man that got him into power, Stalin. Stalin died then, and Khrushchev came to power in the USSR and engaged in anti-Stalinism. Given that both Mao and Kim had been creating personality cults like Stalin, they too were subject to this process. Given that Kim Il-sung